Hi, and welcome. I'm Teresa Harris. I'm the director of the AAAS Center for Scientific Responsibility and Justice. And it is really my pleasure today to host this session as part of the week-long Science and Human Rights Coalition's conference, Science and Technology and Human Rights Conference, which this week we're focusing on the right to science. Uh, Long called dormant, the right to science is now wide awake. Unfortunately, the pandemics, the changing climate, digital transformations have really brought it to life and have brought this right to science to the forefront. As those who've been involved in the Science and Human Rights Coalition know well, there's also been a lot of hard work over at least 15 years and more, but definitely the last 15 years, to define the right to science from its framing in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Throughout this online series of sessions this week, we've all learned more about the work that has happened in the past, where we are now, and work that's happening to move us into the future, from the United Nations independent human rights experts who are interpreting different aspects of the right to science, to approaches to equitable and inclusive access to science education and career advancement, to public participation in scientific research. Today, we're joined by four experts in the right to science who are going to help point us toward the future, moving from concepts to applications, from definitions to implementation. How does the right to science, as it's now understood, help us better meet the most urgent human rights challenges the world is facing today? And our speakers leading us through this session on how the right to science is being applied in different contexts are going to pay some special attention to the need to protect scientific freedom as essential to the broader enjoyment of human rights. So I'm very pleased today to welcome our panel, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. Andrea Boggio is a professor of legal studies at Bryant University and adjunct professor in the Master of Performing Arts Management at Polytechnic University of Milan and the Master in Healthcare Administration at Winston-Salem State University. He's been a consultant for the World Health Organization, the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, and the Special Rapporteur on the Freedom of Opinion and Expression. He has written books on the right to science in different applications, and today he's going to talk about the relationship between the right to science in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and scientific responsibility, talking about both scientific integrity and the impact of scientific activities, responsibilities of science, and sharing some specific examples. We're also joined today by Konstantinos Tararis. He is program specialist at UNESCO's Inclusion, Rights, and Intercultural Dialogue section, and for 2 decades has been leading activities on promoting a human rights-based approach to programming and advancing the normative clarification and that is a tongue twister today, operationalization of the right to science. Currently, he's coordinating the implementation of UNESCO's recommendation on science and scientific researchers, and he will be talking more about that in relation to the emphasis on scientific freedom and protection of scientists, and the experience that UNESCO has had advancing the right to science through an STI project in Africa, and some new initiatives on freedom and safety of scientists. We're also joined by Cesar Romano, who is going to talk about how the right to science, if properly understood and unpacked in its many components, can add further weight to the arguments of climate change activists. And he'll also talk about why states, governments have an obligation to fight climate change because of the right to science. he is a professor at and founder of the International Human Rights Center at Loyola Law School, Los Angeles. He helped establish and is a member of the Steering Committee of Science for Democracy, a Brussels-based NGO whose goal is to promote the human right to science. And he really has been a leader in the scholarship around implementation of the right to science. So thank you for joining us today. And we also have Katrine Kinzelbach. Professor Kinzelbach teaches the international politics of human rights and co-directs FAU's MA in human rights. She's also a visiting professor at King's College London, and her research studies how different actors construct, codify, implement, and counteract human rights, how they interact transnationally in human rights processes, and how their tactics change due to digital transformation. She's also focused on the empirical assessment of human rights violations, and she's going to share some of that work today with us, the Academic Freedom Index, which assesses how well states around the world meet their obligation in practice to respect the freedom indispensable for human rights research. So I'll turn it right over to our panel today. Andrea, I believe you're first.
Thank you, and let me share my slides. Thank you again for the invitation, and my talk will be exploring the right to science in the context of scientific responsibility. In 10 minutes, we're going to just scratch the surface of that, but hopefully there will be some food for thoughts, as you were pointing out earlier, that this is a sort of a panel for ways of looking forward, the implementation or realization of the right to science. So there is a core assumption here, which has also been articulated really on Monday during the first panel, particularly by Professor Porsdam, that scientific responsibility is constitutive of the right to science, meaning that is part of the core normative content of the right. And so I will start from that assumption, and I'm just going to point out two dimensions of this assumption without really digging further. The first one is the scientific freedom, scientific responsibility is the other side of the coin with respect to scientific freedom. So when scientific freedom or the protection of scientific freedom is articulated in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, there is no mentioning of scientific responsibility, yet this is an essential part of the recognition of scientific freedom. And the second dimension, which is, I think, a little bit deeper and more connected to the right to science and its specific content, is that the science that fails to, its responsibilities cannot really produce the benefits that it's expected to produce as a human right. And so that's really at the core also of the protection of science as a human right. So what is science responsibility briefly, and then I'm going to articulate some of the standards that I think are associated with its recognition as part of the right to science. There are two dimensions to scientific responsibility. There is an internal responsibility or set of responsibilities and external responsibilities. This is a distinction that has been articulated for a long time. For instance, Karl Popper articulated in 1968 in an address to the International Congress of Philosophy. It's sort of deep roots in the 20th century, if we wish. So the internal responsibility is really a responsibility of scientific integrity. Is what it is commonly known as scientific integrity. sometimes is referred also as research integrity. I believe they are slightly different, as you can see to the right. Research integrity is really the integrity of science, to make sure that the process of producing scientific knowledge follows certain norms, and so that the outcomes can be considered outcomes of integrity. So the knowledge that is produced is one that can be trusted as being scientific because it was produced according to certain norms. So that's the integrity of science, or research integrity. There is another element of scientific integrity called integrity in science, which I label scientific citizenry. So is the standing of a scientist as a member of the scientific community, which concerns the sharing of data, rules of authorship, respect of colleagues, and other norms that apply to the membership, again, of an individual or research group within the larger context of the scientific community. So failure to act with integrity is a failure to produce science that will be considered to be protected under as a matter of right to science. The second aspect of scientific responsibility concerns the external responsibility, and that's where I'm going to spend most of my time, and I think there is more interesting work to be done there. So the external responsibilities are really about evaluating the impacts of scientific progress. With my co-author and co-panelist today, Cesare Romano, we are developing a book on the normative content of right in science, and there we label this particular set of responsibility as responsible anticipation. So it's about anticipating and monitoring the impacts of scientific progress. And I'll tell a little bit more what it means, because it's sort of a novel concept applied to scientific responsibility. The way in which I break down, or we break down, responsible anticipation is really through the identification of three particular practices that, if carried out, would discharge the responsibility of scientists as part of their responsibility to anticipate, or the external responsibilities. There is a responsibility to contemplate, which fundamentally is an activity of self-reflection of scientists as a community, in which they need to articulate a vision of where scientific process is going, and also identify ways in which scientific progress will have an impact on the world. Now, the impacts here are many, and international law considers many impacts to be relevant in this analysis. There is, of course, impacts on other humans, and there is a very robust body of regulation, for instance, of research of human subjects. There is an impact on future generation that is an emerging norm and international law. And there is impacts on non-human animals, on the environment through sustainability. And so the kind of impacts, the range of impacts that ought to be contemplated as part of these self-reflection activities are really multiple, and also qualitatively really different. Now, the second step of this process is really to control. So it is the duty of the scientific community to also engage in self-governance. If impacts are identified that are harmful and therefore must be avoided, then the scientific community ought to organize the self in a way to prevent those impacts from happening. Self-governance, it's a balancing exercise between promoting and allowing research and scientific progress to happen, and self-restraint, where there is a belief that scientific progress may not be beneficial to humanity in the broader sense that I described earlier. I'll identify some example of self-governance a little bit later. And finally, I believe there is a duty to communicate. And as I will again identify later or discuss later, I believe this is primarily an activity of the scientific community, the responsible anticipation, but it is connected to the larger societal elements, the other social actor. So certainly there is a duty to communicate the outcomes of self-reflection and self-governance, so that the policymaker and social actors can understand how scientists see the problems and address them. So that will be sort of the core communication, and can also be a little bit deeper than that, articulating some of the assumptions and the evaluations done as part of self-reflection. It can also be more than just communicating, but it's actually engaging in a dialogue. But certainly there is an element of necessary communication of what a responsible anticipation is to non-scientific actors. Going back to the right to science, this is also part of the duty to, or the right of everyone to participate in scientific progress. So communication is a tool that enables participation of non-scientists, or at least the scientists that haven't participated in anticipation, to the process of understanding how scientific science is making progress. So I have articulated some of these ideas. I'm going to post the link after my talk in a pretty short contribution for the annual publication of GESTA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Accelerator. It's an organization that is also working in this space of the right to science with a focus on science diplomacy. And so some of these ideas are explained there. And again, I'll identify the reading after the talk. So in the last couple of minutes, I really want to bring some point for analysis of discussion. So self-reflection is a necessary but demanding activity. Scientists are busy doing the research, busy in obtaining money with other demands for their professions. And so it's hard to find the time and the space to engage in collective self-reflection, but it's also a necessary activity. So it certainly requires support also from institutions, scientific institutions, but also funding agencies and other actors of the research ecosystem. So it's an activity that needs really to be supported more broadly than just within at the level of efforts, if you wish, of the individual scientist. Now, the second point is that self-governance has been successful in the biosciences, and is much harder or difficult in other contexts, thinking, for instance, of artificial intelligence. And I believe it has been successful in the biosciences because the biosciences is a context or an area of science policy with a pretty intense degree of regulation, from regulation of research with human subjects. There's pre-approval, marketing pre-approval for the medical products, drugs, devices, vaccines. There is governance of research involving embryos and stem cells and gene editing. And so because of the robust regulation around science, it's much easier to engage in self-governance because some of the principles are more clear and articulated, more clear and evident to scientists. In other contexts, like the development of software and digital commercial applications, that's where most of the AI, it is much harder. And if we see how that is working, I think the industry itself is really looking for opportunities for self-regulation, but it's much harder given the lack of institutional context and really regulation in many ways. And so that's where perhaps the creative work of thinking about how human rights standards can be applied to less regulated context of scientific progress, it would be particularly valuable. And I think further there is a role, there is this question about the proper role of society or societal involvement in the process. And I think here maybe hold a minority view, where I believe that these responsible participation is really primarily an activity of scientists, where there is a duty to communicate, but maybe there is not necessarily a duty to involve societal actors from the very beginning. I think it's important to have a scientific assessment of anticipation and then have a societal assessment of anticipation. And the two may be conducted separately. I believe there is value in generating knowledge from both processes. And I think scientists may be able to think about these questions in isolation more with more precision than if the debate involved the more social actors. So these are 3 questions that I sort of submit to the panel or the future work of the coalition. And I'm going to stop here because I think I'm running out of time, but I'd be happy to pick up any of these issues later in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for starting us off. Kostas, I believe you're next. Yes.
Thank you, Teresa. I hope you can hear me clearly. First of all, many thanks to AAAS for the opportunity given to UNESCO to participate to this very timely conversation. And also allow me to convey the appreciation of my colleague, Angela Mello, who, for your understanding, because unfortunately, due to a family emergency, she was not able to join this panel. As for myself, I'm doubly delighted to take part in this conversation. First of all, because the right to science is I'm particularly attached to. I have been working on this subject from the early 2000s, preparing the ground for the UNESCO initiative that resulted in the Venice Statement on the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications back in 2009. But also because of AAAS, who has been a very close partner of UNESCO, working with the organization since the 70s, but particularly since the 2000s, working closely around the efforts to bring to life the right to science, starting with the Venice Statement of 2009. So let me start perhaps by reiterating the obvious and something that you touched upon, Teresa, in your introduction, which is that the right to science is still to earn in practice an equal place comparing to other rights that are contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Neither is it known to the broader public nor to professional groups related to science, perhaps with the exception of the well-informed AAAS constituencies. But still, the scientific community is now in the process of understanding what the right to science is about and how they can benefit from its application. Also, and you have mentioned it as well, it's not given equal weight by human rights mechanisms such as the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the Human Rights Council. Indicatively, there was a 2021 research that looked at the recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review and found that only 20 out of 1,200 recommendations that related to the freedom of expression concerned actually the freedom of scientists. Now, of course, there has been progress. You mentioned yourself the general comment of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and also an important role in changing the landscape is played by the special rapporteurs, the special rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, who spoke in a panel a couple of days ago, and also other special rapporteurs like the on toxic waste and human rights, etc. But there's still much to be done. But why is it so important that the right to science comes to the certain stage? Indeed, our world is faced with many interconnected challenges. I don't need to enumerate. I mean, each one has in mind climate change that we will be listening to, health emergencies, deepening inequalities, shifting demographics, and many others. And we know that to address them effectively, we need more science, but not just any science. We need science that is rooted in justice, inclusion, and human rights. And indeed, the right to science can be instrumental in making that happen. I think As you mentioned, Teresa, in the beginning, the COVID pandemic, we came out of it with a very strong message in this respect. And I know that you can say much more based on a joint research project that is currently in final stage. So how do we make this happen? I think, it's a common basis on Andrea's presentation, but also I'm sure in the presentations that preceded and the ones that follow, that we need an urgent revamp of the agenda. And today we have a much stronger normative basis. You have been listening to the work that is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant. I would like to highlight a few things coming from the UNESCO perspective. And so UNESCO has been building since the 90s a strong normative arsenal, which provides a solid basis and foundation for promoting the right to science. There were earlier instruments that focused on ethics of science and particularly bioethics, and they paved the way for the 2017 recommendation on science and scientific researches, which is an area where I particularly focus. So that recommendation of 2017 spells out a comprehensive vision for national science ecosystems and how they can be driven by human rights, inclusion, and ethical principles. So among the 10 key areas of the 2017 recommendation, you have the connection of science with UN ideals, the science-society interface that Andrea touched upon at the closing of his presentation, the freedom and responsibility of scientists, likewise, ethics and integrity. And of course, in 2021, there were two more groundbreaking instruments that were adopted, namely the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence and the recommendation of open science. Of course, norms are meaningful only when translated into action on the ground. And currently, I can say that we have a favorable momentum at UNESCO that we should take full advantage of. And let me briefly elaborate a bit on that. So the trigger, and as particularly concerns the 2017 recommendation on science and scientific researchers, has been a project that we implemented with the support of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency in 6 African countries. Our work was about transforming these countries' science, technology, and innovation systems to promote sustainable development. And so the project it was really the first attempt to implement the recommendation on the ground. And the issue of freedom of scientific research, scientific freedom, was really at the core. There's a research project that we're currently finalizing looking at the status of scientific freedom in those 6 African countries, and was really a key element in many of the outputs. And at the end of the day, we're really proud of what was accomplished, which included some new and revised policies on SDI in 3 countries, with 1 more underway in Ghana, national action plans and inclusive platforms in all 6 countries that will be really the foundation for taking whatever work was done forward. But interestingly, beyond the positive impact of this project in the region, and I can mention, for example, a decision of a ministerial meeting of the SADC that was issued in June of this year, whereby there was a request to continue the project and expand the project in other countries of the SADC sub-region. There were also important global benefits. And a main benefit of that was a decision that was taken by UNESCO's executive board in May this year to scale up efforts for the implementation of the recommendation. And importantly, and this is a bit the connection with what we are discussing, what Andrea started discussing, and what you will hear from other panelists, is the emphasis on freedom of scientific research and the safety of scientists, which is key area 7 of the recommendation. So why the focus on freedom and safety of scientists? I mean, we know that science thrives in open and safe environment where ideas flow freely. We know that when scientific researchers enjoy intellectual autonomy and safety, the diffusion of science is facilitated, international scientific cooperation enhanced, and ultimately scientific progress accelerated for the benefit of all humanity. And we've seen, if we make an analogy, the benefits of freedom in the case of media freedoms that strengthen accountability and democratic institutions, and also the freedom of artists and creators that enriches creativity and cultural life. And of course, this is something that comes of the work of UNESCO on these topics for many years. Available data describes a chilling environment for scientific freedom with scientists under increasing pressure. And I'm sure Katrine will be sharing much more information about that. How science can flourish, for example, when 39% of scientists working on climate change report in a survey being victim of online abuse, or according to another study, 22% of scientists received threats of violence after sharing their COVID-19 related findings with the media. Or lastly, when 1 in 2 women scientists claim to have experienced sexual harassment at work, as per a 2022 study. So in that context, the Executive Board of UNESCO took a decision in May that created enabling conditions for our next milestone. And that milestone is a discussion that will happen at the 42nd session of the UNESCO General Conference in November this year, where the proposal to launch the UNESCO Program on Freedom and Safety of Science will be discussed. We are optimistic that the reception by the full community of UNESCO member states will be positive. And so a dedicated program like the one that UNESCO has on freedom of journalists and artists on scientists would be framed by the recommendation, obviously, and allow us to develop responses that are coherent to the needs of our member states and their priorities. And of course, ultimately make a difference on the ground. Among other interventions that we are contemplating in this respect, we would like to do, for instance, create a space for regular dialogue among science policy advisors, collect and analyze data on trends and challenges, building really on the excellent work that is already happening, and you will hear some examples afterwards by colleagues, to strengthen institutional capacities, leveraging experience such as the one I mentioned with the STI project in the 6 African countries, but also to build alliances for more effective advocacy and awareness raising. We know that the challenges that we're facing are complex, and their complexity is only exacerbated by the persisting uncertainty and the fragility that we see across regions. But this year that, as you know, is marked by a double commemoration, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 30th anniversary of the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, could become a turning point to put the rights to science on an equal footing with other human rights, but also a turning point to leverage the right to science for a faster transformation of our societies. So let us join hands to make this the best of this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cesar. Your turn.
Thank you, Teresa. Hello, everyone. It's my turn, and I would like to talk about how the right to science can be applied in the context of the climate change emergency. Just as a little bit of a background, I am quote unquote recycling a presentation in the sense that this week, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is a major human rights body of the Americas, being an organ of the Organization of American States, is holding hearings regarding an advisory opinion that has been requested by Colombia and Chile on the question of what obligations states of the Americas have in regard to climate change. And I had the chance to make a presentation to the court about what obligations states have to fight climate change as a result of the right to science. And so this is today's presentation. Let me switch to some slides here for a second. Okay, all right. So as Andrea already mentioned before, the two of us, we have been working for many years now and to a book about trying to distill the normative contents of the right to science, which will come out next year in 2024 with Oxford University Press. In the book, we have essentially taken the right to science and we've broken it down in 21 specific rights. And these specific rights, we have gathered them in 4 separate clusters. One is the right to scientific process and scientific freedom. The second one is the right to responsible scientific progress. The third one is the right to participate in scientific progress. And the fourth one is the right to benefit from scientific progress, right? So of course, each cluster contains multiple rights, which sometimes we have further broken down for sake of clarity. And for each right that we identify the normative basis, the normative content, the corresponding duties that states, but also sometimes also individuals, namely scientists, have, and indicators that could be used to measure progress or regress towards the fulfillment of the right. So here is the big scheme in a second on showing you how we broke it down and what are the rights that are part of it. But there's no time definitely to go into it. So I had to pick only 6 rights amongst the 21 that I think are most pertinent when it comes to discussion on climate change. Now, in order to translate the right to science, which is of course applies to every scientific activity and is very broad, to the specific of climate change, I pick one specific document, which is a UN document, a UNESCO document of 2017, which is called the Declaration of Ethical Principles in Relation to Climate Change. Now, why do I think it's most pertinent to use that document to read the right to science through? First of all, although it's a document that talks about ethical principles, once these ethical principles are looked through the lens of the normative content of the right, and therefore legal documents in which the right to science is articulated, then the ethical principles help clarifying the normative content on the right. The second one is that, yes, although it's a non-binding document that was adopted by the General Assembly of UNESCO, has been adopted by consensus. And because UNESCO at the time in 2017, before the United States withdrew, but now the United States is back into the game, they had 194 members, which is basically the membership of the United Nations. And that, as every good international legal scholar knows, it can be a very good indication of what the opinio juris is on the content of the right to science of the international community. And third, I would like to mention that because UNESCO has historically been the agency of the United Nations that has done the most work on clarifying the normative content of the right to science, it's definitely pertinent to use a UNESCO document of this nature to read the right to science when applied to climate change. So amongst the many duties that are contained in the right to science, again, I have picked 6. The first one is the duty to ensure integrity in decision-making. The second is the duty to promote literacy in science and climate change. The third one is the duty to share and disseminate knowledge regarding the causes, modalities, and impacts of climate change and responses to it. The first is the duty to ensure participation in science affairs. The fifth is the duty to align policies with best scientific available knowledge. And last but not the least, the duty to anticipate, avoid, or minimize harm, and a general duty of prudence in acting. Now, we don't have much time, so I'll be happy to circulate either the PowerPoints or actually point you to the document of ethical principles in relation to climate change on the UNESCO website. But I use certain parts of that document that I quote here in the PowerPoint in order to come to some normative takeaways. And I will focus on the normative takeaways because probably these are the most interesting to you, but were also the most interesting to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in their search for the normative content on the right to science. So normative takeaway, under the heading duty to ensure integrity in decision-making, we can say that states must ensure that science that circulates in both international and domestic science policy interfaces is reliable and up to date. The second one is a duty to ensure that international and domestic policy science interfaces are free from undue influence, right? And this is both influence of a corporate nature or political nature, ideological nature, any nature. Needs to be only about science. 3, states have a duty to ensure a complete disclosure of all forms of conflict of interest of all participators all people participating in science policy interfaces. And they have a duty to ensure that international and domestic science policy interfaces are free from pseudoscience and junk science, for lack of a better term. So again, it's a duty to ensure the integrity of the decision-making process relating to climate change. Second, it's a duty to promote literacy in science and climate change, which specifically means that states must empower citizens by ensuring that they have adequate scientific literacy to understand the problems that climate change creates, and also what are the responses that can be deployed to address it. Third, there is a duty to share and disseminate knowledge regarding the causes, modalities, and impacts of climate change and responses to it, which means that states must disseminate scientific knowledge about climate change, focusing on scientific knowledge that relates to adaptation and mitigation and the strategies to achieve both of them. And also, fourth duty is a duty to ensure participation in science affairs, which means that the states must recognize and protect the right of scientists to participate in public policy debates concerning climate change. They need to set up mechanisms and fora for public discussion about climate change policy, and try to involve as many representatives from all the various stakeholders and varieties of groups. And they need to ensure broad participation in all science policy interfaces to make sure that institutions are actually, again, representing a broad spectrum. Fifth, which is states have a duty to align policies with best scientific available knowledge, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be the most interested to many people in this panel. So that means that states must internationally, they keep on supporting the IPCC, which is the major science policy interface when it comes to climate change. And domestically, they need to establish new science policy interfaces or support the one that they have, and act on the knowledge available by adopting the recommendations of their science policies interfaces. And finally, a duty of anticipation, which connects to what Andrea was talking about earlier about the responsibilities of science, which means that states must engage in anticipation driven by the knowledge available on science policies interfaces. They must assess both the short and long-term impact of action and inaction in areas of climate innovation policy. Again, they must ensure that the best scientific available knowledge drives all assessment. They must also avoid lost opportunities for innovation. There is a concern that if too much prudence is applied on possible responses to climate change, we are going to miss on valuable opportunities to address the problems as fast as we can, as the emergency demands. And they have to contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of course, here, international, local, NECs, all these various species, in several different ways that I propose here. This was, in short and very fast, an example of how the right to science can translate from very broad, terse, and simple requirements into specific action that is actionable and that is concrete on the ground on the specific of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really important example. Katrine.
Yes, thank you very much. It's now my turn, and I have also brought some slides because my focus today is going to be maybe a little bit of an odd one out in this excellent panel because it is highly empirical, so not policy or concept related. But the question that I'm going to address is to what extent scholars are actually free to conduct research, And I'm going to present the latest data that we have published in 2023 this year of the Academic Freedom Index. As has been well covered by other speakers on the panel, there is an international commitment under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in which states undertake to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research and creative activity. And this is a wonderful de jure situation. We have a commitment by 171 states that's legally binding under international law. But of course, their commitment in law is not necessarily applied in practice. So we were really interested in exploring what we expected to be a gap between this high de jure commitment with the de facto situation. There is, of course, a lot of debate on what the freedom of science or academic freedom actually entails. My argument would be that there is nevertheless a sort of common core that most scholars could agree on. And here we do also have now for the last 2 years or 3 years, a document by the relevant committee, the treaty body of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which lists a few components of what this freedom includes. It includes the protection of researchers from undue influence on their independent judgment. I think here the committee goes a little bit beyond the treaty text in that it uses the term protection. So arguably also the state should protect scholars from undue influence by third parties. Then researchers can set up autonomous research institutions to define the aims and objectives of their research, withdraw from research projects where they have concerns about their ethical value. They are also free to cooperate with other researchers, both nationally and internationally, and of course to share data. We have taken a somewhat pragmatic approach when constructing the Academic Freedom Index. We looked at human rights law and also at the academic debate on academic freedom and came up with 5 indicators, which really stresses that academic freedom, as many have already pointed out here on the panel, is a multidimensional concept. I just heard that the right to science might be broken down to even 21 components. Well, that goes much beyond the specificity of our index, but we here, of course, only look at the freedom indispensable for scientific research. So only one component of the right to science. And what we cover is the freedom to research and teach, the freedom of academic exchange and dissemination, then institutional dimensions, common one, institutional autonomy, but also something that is maybe less known, which we call campus integrity, which we define as the absence of externally induced fears or incentives to self-censor. And then there is an indicator that's called freedom of academic and cultural expression, a formulation that can also be found in many constitutions around the world. And this is the only indicator that actually already existed in the VDEM dataset, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second, before we constructed the index. But we felt that the freedom of academic expression is really only one component of the freedom indispensable for scientific research. And when you look at the specific formulations in the code book on this 5th indicator, you'll see that this is kind of classically framed as a negative obligation on states. So it's the freedom from government interference, whereas we expanded this notion in the other 4 indicators and said infringements could come not only from government, but from other non-academic actors such as business corporations, actually the public and advocacy organizations, from religious groups, from externally appointed university bodies, so bodies that were not elected, that introduce non-academic considerations into the scientific endeavor. And those could limit scientists' freedom. We also recognize that academic freedom is a latent variable. That's a term empirical scholars would use for concepts that you cannot directly measure. So you cannot, go immediately observe without any sort of translation the level of academic freedom in a particular country. So you have to think about how to actually monitor academic freedom. And there are various data sources that you could think about. And we did think about when we first started the index. So what about the Euro assessments? But then there might be a discrepancy between the law and practice. Of course, there's long established practices of self-reporting, both within the United Nations, but also in other projects like the European University Scorecard, for example. On a global scale, though, we felt that maybe not all governments can be trusted in providing bona fide self-reports. You can collect events on specific infringements, such as the detention of scholars. Though if you want to produce data that's comparable over time and also over space, it is extremely problematic to use events data because that is shaped by a number of information effects that you can hardly control for. When you think about survey among scientists around the world, that raises a lot of logistical but also security questions. And we finally settled on expert assessments and reached out to the Wiedemann Institute at the University of Gothenburg, which has developed, I would say, one of the best data sets using expert assessments for various dimensions of democracy. And they were interested in expanding their monitoring of the academic space from just this fifth indicator that pre-existed the Academic Freedom Index to also cover the other 4 indicators listed here on this slide. Now, the way the Wiedemann project works is that it basically uses experts' assessments as imperfect manifestations of an unobservable concept, right? So we recognize that academic freedom is not directly measurable. We ask a number of experts to give us their ratings, ordinal ratings on a predefined scale, for which we provide a lot of definitions in the codebook. And we love experts because they can contextualize information. They're often typically residing in the country that they code. But of course, there are a number of problems when you think about aggregation. What about these experts' scale perception? What about potential biases, etc.? So this is exactly what Wiedemann is so famous for. They developed a model that helps us to usefully aggregate various experts' assessments, but also actually calculate not only the most likely value, the point estimate, but also the degree of uncertainty, which is a function of many factors, but of course, notably of the disagreement among experts that are involved in the coding. So the codebook provides a lot of information. We also use anchoring, vignettes, and bridge coding. So various instruments to make coders scores more comparable and the final point estimate more reliable. So far, we have had the great pleasure of involving 2,197 coders from around the world. And on average, we have 9.3 coders per country and year. There's a high degree of transparency on the number of coders and also on the coder disagreement. All the disaggregated data can be downloaded and is freely available online. Now, I want to show you the latest map that we published. This was the degree of academic freedom as we found it in our index project for 2022. Published in early 2023, and we're going to release the new data again in March next year. Now, the red is a low degree of academic freedom with the 5 indicators mentioned, and the blue is a high degree of academic freedom. Of course, you look at this map and we immediately think about sort of the politics of representation. So just a quick mention that we are working on various forms of maps and presentation that you can find also on our Academic Freedom Index website. What we're very proud about is that there is an interactive globe where you can explore the world, and when you hover above a country, like I did here above the United States, it will show you also the trend. Is it going up or down in comparison with 10 years ago? And then you can click on it and explore the data yourself. Worldwide, we have actually found, also going back in time, initially a significant improvement in academic freedom related to the democratization process in the 1990s. You can see here on the left-hand side, the global average, which is a country-based average in the middle, in the red line, goes up significantly. There's also a large degree of uncertainty attached to the data. And so the declines in the last 10 years are within the confidence interval. So when we work with country-based average, we are not sure whether this is actually only statistical noise or whether we have a significant decline. On the right-hand side, we use a different calculation. We don't only use the country-based average, but we use a population-weighted average. And here you can see a much more dramatic decline, a decline that is definitely outside of the confidence bounds. And this is because a number of highly populous countries have shown significant deterioration in academic freedom in recent years. When we speak about declines, we would only identify countries where the trend is actually sort of the drop goes outside of the confidence bounds. I have brought data from 4 democracies here for the last 50 years. Hungary and India are at the bottom and have a rather dramatic decline. According to VDEM data, these 2 countries no longer qualify as democracies, but are now considered electoral autocracies. So the decline in academic freedom is accompanied or probably also causally related in some ways with the decline in democracy. But also countries that remain democratic, up here, the United States and Mexico, have shown in our data statistically significant declines in recent years. And here's a map of all countries that have either improved or deteriorated in the last 10 years. So you can see 22 countries from different world regions in the bottom half. And the size of the dot would give you an indication of population size. So the larger the dot, the larger the population. So 22 countries we have found in our recent updates show statistically significant declines in academic freedom. We don't really talk about the improvement so much. So I want to stress that I also find that really, really important. But unfortunately, in these 5 countries, less than 1% of the world's population are at home. So the declines are more dramatic than the improvements. What is now interesting, of course, is, how to work towards improvements, how to reverse this trend of decline, but also for all the many countries that have stagnated over the years. We should recognize that these stagnations often sit at a far too low level. So no dramatic decline, but also not very good scores in terms of the degree of academic freedom. There remains a lot of work in order to lift all countries up and not only address the declining countries. And we hope that the data can be of some use as policymakers grapple with these challenges. We do get some reactions from countries, either because they celebrate their good scores or they complain about negative data. Sometimes they then try to discredit the index, but we take this actually as positive news that governments around the world slowly care about how they're being assessed. We also think that the academic community itself, foundations, but also university leadership can make use of the data when they think about funding projects or entering academic collaborations. We do not advocate a sort of decoupling from countries where academic freedom is very low, but rather much in the spirit of what has been discussed in the panel, a sort of a duty to anticipate and minimize harm in these collaborations with countries where academic freedom is not well protected. We also hope that the UN bodies can make some use of the data that we provide. Before I come to an end, I want to stress that, of course, the declines, when you disaggregate at the level of the indicators, look very different. So I've compared here the United States and Egypt to very, very different countries, obviously also to very different regime types, but both decliners in our index. And you can see here that in the United States, the only indicator where we haven't got a serious decline is an indicator that assesses to what extent government interferes with academic expression. The other 4 indicators that don't only look at government infringements, but more broadly at non-academic influence on scholarly work decline. And I think this is important that we do discuss not only government infringements, but also other actors' involvement in limiting academic freedom. We haven't really spoken much about managerialism, for example, in this panel yet, but many, many different players are important, funders, but also religious groups, and the public that increasingly gets confronted, as was mentioned before, with bogus science, and that there is a risk that they lose trust in the academy as a sort of more professional representation of science. In Egypt, on the other hand, the government clearly represses very significantly also the academy, and more generally, of course, the degree of academic freedom is significantly smaller than in the United States. So I want to close by stating that we are really keen to expand our group of coders, and that we call on everybody interested to, reach out to us with any comments on the conceptualization, but also on specific scores that you might disagree with or find problematic. We hope that the data can be, the beginning of a debate and not the end of a debate. And we are really committed to continuing this work in a collaborative spirit, and hope that we can improve the data together as we go along.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this example with us, which I think helps to get at one of the questions that we received here about how do we move from the discussions around in a legal context and the discussions we're having in the multilateral human rights bodies, UNESCO, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. How do we move from that to our day-to-day practice? So thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And so I am going to invite everyone who's still here. If you have questions we haven't been able to answer, please email them to us at srj@AAAS.org, and we will share those with the panelists and try to answer you directly. I want to thank you all for your presentations, for sharing your really important and insightful work with us today. And I know we'll be continuing these conversations in the meetings that we're having in person around the right to science next week on Monday and Tuesday here in Washington, D.C. I also want to thank you, everyone who's still here, and remind you that we have one more online session tomorrow where everyone will get to meet and learn from the science, technology, and human rights future gen scholars and learn about their work. We also have a meetup at right immediately after those presentations for students and early career scientists, human rights practitioners, everyone who's interested in science and human rights to join us at that tomorrow. So the session is at 2 and the meetup is at 3. Thank you so much again to our wonderful panelists, and thank you to everyone who joined us today.